June 12, 1962, 7 o'clock a.m. A guard walks down the cold, concrete corridors of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary for the routine morning bed check. Selby 150. An inmate lies motionless in his bunk, blankets pulled up, facing the wall. The guard moves on. Selby 152. Another sleeping figure. Selby-138 is the same. Nothing unusual. Just another morning on the rock. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. When that guard looked closer at those sleeping figures, he discovered something that would spark one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. Those weren't men in those beds. They were dummy heads, carefully crafted decoys made from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin had vanished into the night. 3 men had done the impossible. They had escaped from Alcatraz, the prison that was supposed to be escape-proof. But here's the question that has haunted investigators for over 60 years. Did they make it too? Freedom? Or did the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay claim them that night? Welcome to the most legendary prison escape in American history. To understand why this escape is so legendary, you need to understand what Alcatraz really was. This wasn't just any prison. Picture this, a 22-acre rocky island sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by freezing water with currents so strong they could pull a grown man under it in seconds. 1.5 miles from the mainland, close enough to see the lights of the city, but impossibly far to reach. This wasn't just any prison. This was America's answer to its most dangerous criminals. Alcatraz opened as a federal penitentiary in 1934, right in the middle of America's war on crime. The Great Depression had created a wave of bank robbers and gangsters, and the government needed somewhere to put the ones who kept escaping from regular prisons. So they turned a military fortress into the most secure prison ever built. The rules were simple and brutal. 1 guard for every 3 prisoners, steel bars reinforced with tool-proof metal, gun towers watching every inch of the island, searchlights sweeping the perimeter all night long, metal detectors at every checkpoint, daily head counts, routine cell searches. And then there was the water itself, the ultimate guard. The bay's temperature hovered around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to kill you from hypothermia in 20 minutes. The currents that could reach 6 knots during ebb tide, strong enough to drag you straight out to the Pacific Ocean. The prison held America's most. Wanted: Al Capone, the notorious Chicago mob boss; George Machine Gun Kelly; Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. These weren't ordinary criminals. These were men who had escaped from other prisons. Men too dangerous or too clever for regular facilities. The government's message was clear. If you end up in Alcatraz, you're never getting out. And they were right. From 1934 to 1963, there were 14 official escape attempts involving 36 men. 23 were recaptured. 6 were shot and killed, drowned, and 5 were listed as missing and presumed drowned. But only 3 of those missing men captured the world's imagination. Let me introduce you to the men who would attempt the impossible. Frank Lee Morris was 35 years old in 1962. And if there was ever a criminal genius, it was him. The FBI measured his IQ at 133, far above average. But intelligence didn't save him from a life of crime. Morris was born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, an orphan at age 11. Bouncing between foster homes, he was convicted of his first crime at just 13 years old. By 16, he'd made his first prison escape, fleeing to Miami before being recaptured. This became his pattern. Rob, get caught, escape, get caught again. He served time in multiple prisons across the South. Louisiana State Penitentiary, Florida prisons. Each time, he tried to escape. And often, he succeeded, at least temporarily. But each escape added time to his sentence and a growing reputation. By 1960, after a bank robbery in Louisiana, federal authorities had enough. They sent Morris to Alcatraz with a 14-year sentence and a warning stamp on his prison file. Escape risk? They had no idea how right they were. Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, quiet, observant, always thinking. He quickly realized that if he was going to escape the rock, he'd need help. And soon, that help arrived. John William Anglin came to Alcatraz in October 1960. His younger brother, Clarence, followed in January 1961. The brothers were 32 and 31 years old, sons of poor Georgia farmers who'd raised 14 children. John and Clarence weren't criminal masterminds like Morris, but they were persistent. They'd committed burglaries and robberies throughout Alabama, Florida, and Georgia since they were teenagers. And like Morris, they had a talent for escaping. The brothers had tried to break out of every prison they'd been. Sent to. When they robbed the Bank of Columbia in Alabama in 1958, authorities decided they needed maximum security. Alcatraz was the only answer. But here's the thing that prison officials didn't realize: Morris and the Anglin brothers already knew each other. They'd served time together at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary years before. And when prison administrators assigned them to adjoining cells in Alcatraz's B block, they'd unknowingly created the perfect conditions for the most elaborate escape plan in prison history. There was a fourth man in the conspiracy, Ellen West, a car thief with his own history of escape. Attempts, West was housed near the others and became part of the plan early on. For men, for adjoining cells, and one shared dream, freedom. The planning began sometime in late 1961. For 6 months, these men worked on an escape plan so elaborate, so meticulous, that it sounds like something out of a Hollywood movie, and actually, it would become one Clint Eastwood's 1979 film Escape from Alcatraz brought the story to millions. But the real story is even more incredible. Here's what they figured out. Their cells in B block had ventilation grates at the bottom of the back wall, near the floor. These grates led to a utility corridor that ran behind all the cells, a corridor that guards rarely checked. But there was a problem. The grates were only about 6 inches by 9 inches. Far too small for a grown man to fit through. So they decided to make them bigger. Much bigger. Morris, the brains of the operation, came up with the method. They would use whatever tools they could find to chip away at the concrete around the grates, slowly widening the holes until they were large enough to crawl through. But how do you get tools in a maximum security prison? The answer? You make them. The men collected discarded saw blades from the prison workshop. They stole metal spoons from the dining hall during meals, slipping them into their pockets when guards weren't looking. And then, in an act of pure ingenuity, they took an electric motor from a vacuum cleaner and fashioned it into a makeshift drill. Every night, after lights out at 9:30 p.m., they would work on their cells quietly, patiently, chipping away at the concrete, millimeter by millimeter. The noise was a problem. Even quiet chipping could echo through the cell block, so Morris used his accordion during music hour. He would play loudly, masking the sounds of drilling and chipping coming from the cells, but making. The holes was only the beginning. They had to hide their work during the day. So they created fake ventilation grates out of cardboard, carefully painted to look like the real thing. When guards came by for cell inspections, all they saw were normal grates. They had no idea that behind those painted pieces of cardboard, the holes were getting bigger and bigger. Once they could fit through the openings, the men discovered something incredible. The utility corridor behind their cells was almost never patrolled, and it had a way to the roof. They began sneaking out of their cells at night, climbing up to the top tier of the cell block, which was vacant and unused. And there, in the darkness above the prison, they set up a secret workshop. This is where the escape plan became truly extraordinary. Using magazines from the prison library, Morris found plans for life preservers in a November 1960 issue of Popular Mechanics. He also discovered information about navigation in a May 1960 to Sports Illustrated. Learning about channel buoys and water currents, armed with this knowledge, the men began to build their escape equipment. The raft was the centerpiece. They started stealing raincoats, more than 50 of them in total, olive green, rubberized prison-issue raincoats. Inmates would wear them out to the recreation yard, take them off, and have someone else pick them up slowly. The raincoats made their way up to the secret workshop. The men stitched the raincoats together by hand to create a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft. But stitching alone wouldn't keep it waterproof. They needed to seal the seams. So they used liquid plastic from the prison workshop and the heat from nearby steam pipes, too. Vulcanized the seams, essentially melting them together to create a watertight seal. This technique was incredibly sophisticated for prison inmates using stolen materials. They also made life preservers using the same raincoat method, carefully stitching and sealing them to provide flotation for paddles. They scavenged plywood and brass screws, creating crude but functional oars, and to inflate the raft once they reached the water, they stole a concertina musical instrument similar to an accordion from another inmate. They modified it to work as a bellows, a pump to fill the raft with air. Every detail was planned. Every problem had a solution. But there was still one massive obstacle. How would they fool the guards during the escape itself? The answer became the most iconic part of the whole story. The men knew that guards conducted regular head counts throughout the night. If their cells appeared empty, alarms would sound immediately. They'd never make it off the island. So they decided to create decoys, fake heads that would appear to be them sleeping in their bunks, using a homemade mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper. They sculpted papier match heads. Then they painted them with flesh-tone paint stolen from the prison maintenance shop to make them look realistic. But the real genius was the hair. They collected real human hair from the barber shop floor, carefully gluing it onto the dummy heads to match their own hairstyles. The result was disturbingly lifelike. In the dim light of a prison cell at night, these dummy heads looked exactly like sleeping inmates. They placed the heads on their pillows and stuffed clothing and towels under their blankets to simulate their bodies. From outside the cell bars, even up close, guards couldn't tell the difference. The dummy heads still exist today. They're on display at Alcatraz as part of the museum. And when you see them in person, you understand why the ruse worked. They're eerie in their realism. By June 1962, everything was ready. The holes in the walls were wide enough to crawl through. The raft and life preservers were completed. The dummy heads were perfected. The escape route was mapped out. They just needed to pick the right night. June 11th, 1962. That was the night. The evening of June 11th started like any other on Alcatraz. Dinner at 5:30 p.m., recreation time, music hour, lights out at 9:30 p.m. But in cells B150, B152, and B138, for men weren't sleeping. They were preparing for the most dangerous night of their lives, around 10 p.m. After the evening head count, they made their move. Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin placed their dummy heads on their pillows, climbed down to the ventilation grates they'd been widening for months, and squeezed through into the utility corridor. But Alan West hit a problem. The concrete around his vent had hardened differently than the others. When he tried to widen his hole at the last minute, he couldn't get through fast enough. He struggled for hours, desperately trying to chip away the concrete. But by the time he finally widened it enough, the others were gone. West gave up and returned to his cell. The plan would continue without him, but his failure to escape would later prove crucial, too. Investigators, because West was the one who told them everything about how it was done. Meanwhile, Morris and the Anglin brothers moved through the utility corridor and began climbing. Using plumbing pipes like a ladder, they scaled up to the top of the cell block, reaching their secret workshop for the last time there. They gathered their gear, the raft, the life preservers, the paddles, the concertina pump. Everything they'd spent 6 months building. From the top of the cell block, they climbed up through a ventilation shaft to the prison roof. This was the moment of maximum danger. They had to remove the rivets from a large ventilation fan covering the shaft. The noise could alert guards. One investigator later described it as loud enough to wake the dead. But incredibly, the guards on duty either didn't hear it or decided not to investigate. The 3 men emerged onto the roof of Alcatraz under the cover of darkness. In front of them stretched the gun towers, searchlights sweeping back and forth, looking for any movement. They waited for the right moment, then moved, using the large exterior pipes running down the side of the building. They descended 50 feet to the ground. Then they climbed over not 1, but to 12-foot barbed wire fences, trying not to make a sound. They made their way to the northeast shore of the island, to a blind spot where the searchlights couldn't reach them. It was near the power plant, hidden from the gun towers. And there, in the darkness of San Francisco Bay, they inflated their raincoat raft using a modified concertina. It took several minutes to pump up the raft, every second bringing the risk of discovery, according to FBI records at approximately 11:40 p.m. Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin pushed the homemade raft into the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay and began paddling toward Angel Island. 2 miles to the north, then they disappeared into the night, and no one has seen them for certain since. The escape wasn't discovered until 7:00 a.m. the next morning, June 12th, when a guard noticed something odd during the routine bed check. The dummy head ruse had worked perfectly. For nearly 9 hours, the men had been gone. And no one knew. When the guard realized what had happened, Alcatraz went into immediate lockdown. The warden, who was on vacation in Napa County, was notified. He didn't believe the men could have survived, but the prison had to be sure. A massive search operation swung into action. The FBI, the Coast Guard, the military, local police, helicopters circled the bay. Boats scoured the water. Search teams combed the shorelines of nearby islands. What they found over the next several days painted a confusing picture. On June 14th, a Coast Guard cutter found one of the prisoners' paddles floating about 200 yards off the southern shore of Angel Island. Sland, later that same day, workers found a wallet wrapped in plastic containing photos and addresses of the Anglin family. On June 21st, shredded pieces of raincoat material believed to be remnants of the raft washed up on the shore near the Golden Gate Bridge. The next day, a deflated life preserver was found floating 50 yards from Alcatraz. Searchers also discovered bits of other materials on Angel Island that appeared to match items from the escape. But they never found bodies. And that's where the mystery begins. The FBI developed a theory based on the strong currents and freezing water temperature. They concluded that Morris and the Anglin brothers must have drowned shortly after launching their raft. The evidence of the raft and paddle, they argued, showed that the raft fell apart in the rough waters and the men were swept out to sea. In 1979, the FBI officially closed the case, declaring the 3 men dead, but the U.S. Marshals Service disagreed. They kept the case open, and they continue to keep it open today. With the men remaining on the wanted list until they would be 99 years old between 2026 and 2031. Why? Because there's evidence suggesting they might have survived. A San Francisco police officer named Robert Checky reported that on the night of the escape, he was standing at the St. Francis Yacht Harbor when he saw a boat in the bay near Alcatraz around midnight. After about 15 minutes, the boat headed toward the Golden Gate Bridge. Checky wondered if the boat had picked up the escapees. But the FBI dismissed his account without serious investigation. Then there were the alleged sightings. In 1989, one of the Anglin brothers' other siblings, Robert, claimed that 2 men showed up at their father's funeral, stayed briefly, wept over the body, and left. He believed they were John and Clarence. In the same year, 2 women contacted the TV show Unsolved Mysteries claiming they'd seen Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris on a farm near Marianna, Florida. Investigators looked but found nothing. And then there's the photograph in 2015. A History Channel special showed an alleged photograph of the Anglin brothers taken in Brazil in 1975 to 13 years after the escape. The photo showed 2 men who looked remarkably like John and Clarence would have looked in their 40s. The Anglin family hired a forensic analyst who claimed the photograph was legitimate. Using facial recognition software, 5 different companies analyzed it. For John Anglin, they found an exact match. For Clarence, it was close but not perfect because his face was turned. The FBI could not verify the photo's authenticity, but they also couldn't disprove it. Then came the letter in 2013. The San Francisco Police Department received a letter that changed everything or made everything more confusing. Depending on your perspective, the letter read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. The writer claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence had died in 2005. He said he was the last one alive and offered to turn himself in for medical treatment. The FBI tested the letter for fingerprints and DNA. The results were inconclusive. The handwriting analysis was also inconclusive. U.S. Marshals investigating the case called it a hoax, someone trying to embarrass authorities, but the Anglin family believes it was real. David Winder, nephew of John and Clarence, told reporters, "My grandmother received roses for several years after the escape," he believes. His uncles survived and lived quiet lives in hiding. The letter's author was never heard from again. So what does science say? Could they have survived? In 2003, the TV show Mythbusters tested whether the escape was possible. Hosts Jamie Hyneman and Adam Savage built a raft using the same materials and methods as Morris and the Anglins. They launched it from Alcatraz at night, and they made it. They successfully reached the Marin headlands at the north end of the Golden Gate Bridge. The conclusion: the escape was definitely possible in 2014. Researchers from the Netherlands conducted an even more sophisticated study using hydraulic modeling to simulate the Bayes currents on TH. The night of June 11, 1962, here's what they discovered. Timing was everything. If Morris and the Anglins left Alcatraz before 11:30 p.m., the strong ebb tide would have swept them out to the Pacific Ocean, where they almost certainly would have drowned. But if they launched their raft between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, the tides would have carried them north toward Horseshoe Bay, just past the Golden Gate Bridge. From there, they could have swum to shore or been carried to land. FBI records suggest they departed around 11:40 p.m., right in the perfect window. The researchers also found that any debris from their raft would naturally drift toward Angel Island, exactly where search. Those found the paddle and other items. Their conclusion: it was certainly possible that the men survived and reached land. In 2022, an episode of the Discovery Channel show Expedition Unknown tried to recreate the journey. The team successfully paddled from Alcatraz to the Marin headlands, proving again that it could be done. And here is something that shocked investigators. In December 1962, just 6 months after the famous escape, another inmate named John Paul Scott successfully swam from Alcatraz to Fort Point at the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge. He was found by teenagers on the shore, suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. But he'd survived a 2.7-mile swim in conditions actually worse than what Morris and the Anglins faced. Scott had used inflated rubber gloves as flotation devices far inferior to the elaborate raft and life preservers Morris' group had built. If Scott could make it using rubber gloves, surely 3 men with a custom-built raft could have made it too today. Hundreds of athletes swim from Alcatraz to San Francisco every year as part of triathlons. It's difficult, but it's absolutely possible. So why does the FBI still insist they drown? The Bureau points to the personal effects found in the water. Why would the men lose important items like family photos and addresses if they made it to shore? They argue these were things the escapees would have protected. But others counter that the men might have intentionally left items behind to make it look like they drowned a decoy just as clever as the dummy heads. More than 60 years later, the Alcatraz escape remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Here's what we know for certain. 3 men: Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin meticulously planned and executed one of the most elaborate prison escapes in history. They spent 6 months secretly building a raft, life preservers, and dummy heads. They climbed out of their cells, scaled to the prison roof, descended to the water, and launched their homemade raft into San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11, 1962. After that, everything becomes speculation. The FBI says they drowned, swept away by currents, and killed by hypothermia. Their official position has never changed, but the U.S. Marshals Service keeps the case open. The men remain on the wanted list, and investigators continue to follow leads, even today. So what do I think? The evidence suggests they had a real chance. The timing of their departure, the sophisticated design of their raft, the proven feasibility of the route, all of it points to survival being possible, even likely. The photograph from Brazil, the letter from 2013, the sightings reported by family members, the roses sent to their grandmother for years after the escape, these details are harder to explain away. Maybe they made it to shore that night, stole a car as planned, and disappeared into new lives. Maybe they fled to South America. As the Brazil photograph suggests, maybe they lived as free men for decades, always looking over their shoulders, never able to contact their families directly. Or maybe the FBI is right. Maybe the freezing water and brutal currents were too much. Maybe 3 men's bodies were swept out to the Pacific Ocean that night, never to be found, and the legend of their escape is greater than the reality. The truth is, we may never know. But isn't that what makes this story so captivating? The mystery, the possibility, the audacity of 3 men who refused to accept that any prison was truly escape-proof. Alcatraz closed permanently in March 1963. Less than a year after the escape, the prison had become too expensive to maintain. And the escape had embarrassed federal authorities. Today, more than 1.5 million tourists visit Alcatraz every year. They walk through the same cell block where Morris and the Anglins lived. They see the dummy heads. Still eerily lifelike after all these decades, they look at the holes in the cell walls. Imagine what that night must have been like. Subby 150 Frank Morris's cell is preserved exactly as it was, complete with the gaping hole in the wall. And standing there, looking at that hole, you can't help but wonder, did they make it? Somewhere, maybe in Brazil, maybe in a small American town. Maybe buried at the bottom of San Francisco Bay. 3 men know the answer, but they're not telling. The escape from Alcatraz remains unsolved, and perhaps that's exactly how the story was meant to end.